Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Vanessa Theme Ament, and welcome back to Holy Foley. My guest this time is Anna Gramlich, and she is a Foley editor at Sony Studios here in Culver City, which is right in our neighborhood in Southern California here. Sony Studios is in Culver City. It used to be the MGM lot, and that is outside the main basic area of Los Angeles. So we'll get started talking about her experiences working at Sony and working in Los Angeles. Anna is originally from Arkansas and then studied and got her master's in sound design, Arkansas, at SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design in Savannah. So we'll cover a little bit of her journey studying sound design and then going to Sony Studios to edit Foley. So first off, how is it at Sony these? Oh, I see a cattail there.
Yes, she's gonna pop in and out whenever she hears me talking. She's got to be here.
And
so
what is
this
your
is Xena.
Xena.
Xena, yes.
So how are things at Sony now that we're completely through the pandemic and you had to go through the whole series of editing on and off through the pandemic? So now we're in late 2023, and how are things there now?
Things have pretty much gone even keel. I know that when the pandemic was going, it was kind of like panic, like, how are we going to do this? When are we going to do this? Because it hit right at the end of all the seasons, which in a way, timing wise, was pretty good because it meant it gave us a little bit of extra few months to be like, okay, how are we going to adjust? Instead of scrambling for like months on end, it was only a couple of weeks where we were just like, okay, we got to get everything done. We're this close to the end of the season. We might as well just finish it. We got these in the can. Let's do this. Let's get it done. If we got to work from home, we got to work from home.
Right.
And we got notified in the middle of the summer of 2020 that everybody's working from home next year. And we're going to do everything. Yeah. At least we got some kind of notice about it. But for the most part, it was just more of like, here are the shows that are coming back. They're going to be a little bit delayed because of production. They're trying to get all the safety measures in place and stuff for that. And they also said, we're going to extend some of you. At the time, I was working primarily on Goldbergs. I believe that was season 8 at the time. And initially they had me started doing Foley entirely in the box for the show because everybody just got really, really busy. And it was one of those shows that it was still good, but it was starting to fall through the cracks of scheduling.
So what that would mean for people who might not understand is you wouldn't just be editing, but also doing some mixing in the Pro Tools so that you wouldn't have to go to the stage to get it mixed there.
Right. Everything I did, I had to basically bring out my MIDI keyboard to walk feet, had to learn how to do structure and build patches and make sure it all sounded.
So when you say you had to walk the feet, you mean you had to do some actual sounds for Foley in it?
I literally had a keyboard in front of me. And depending on who the character was and what shoe they were and what surface they were on, I would basically highlight a patch in my session, hit record on the footstep track, and then I would walk them on my keyboard.
Now, how did that work? Because I know that nothing is anywhere near as good as having an actual Foley artist do the performance of the sonic acting performance of it. So how did that actually work out?
I agree with you wholeheartedly, especially with feet, because the feet can sound very robotic.
Yeah.
Because obviously we have libraries upon libraries of these feet that we recorded and used in other episodes, which are great if you're going into an episode that's already been walked and it's like, well, that doesn't sound too right. I know of a certain sound that does sound right. Let me go get this other footstep. With these patches, we have to create them from those files, but we have to like really shorten them. Like you don't get the ring outs, you don't get the natural reverb that you hear when you hear feet. And so it's very robotic, it's very clunky. I personally don't like it. And honestly, it's hard to do scuffs. Like when most people walk, they're not walking heel toe all the
Oh,
time.
they're not.
They scuff their feet. Even with the stuff I'm working on right now, which is doing music and effects send-offs for soap operas, I do the feed on the keyboard. None of it is scuffs, but when I turn on the production, I hear the scuffs, so it's pretty obvious this is not how we are naturally intended to walk.
I have a story about this. I recently wrote a chapter for the very first sound design handbook. That's an academic book that's going to be out in April, where I write about Foley. So there's never been one before, and there's coming one out, and it's about Foley. And one of the films that I discuss, I start with Edward Scissorhands and end with Batman Returns. And when we worked on Batman Returns, Danny DeVito has a particular way that he scuffed as the Penguin. And when they mixed it, for some reason, they didn't mix the Foley over his scuffing in one area. And you hear him scuffing, and then you hear my footsteps come in for him, which was not what I would have thought the mixer would have done.
Mm-hmm.
And because I would have mixed them together, I would have put them together so that there was a natural transition. And I noticed it, and I thought, wow, I mean, I have my own theories about why the mixer would have done that. And I won't go into it now, it doesn't matter, but it's what you're saying. Actors aren't thinking about any of that, they're doing character. And we, as Foley artists, think about that when we do the performance. We try to top it. But I remember very specifically when I did the character, I had to add more definition to it because it was too scuffy. So you have to do both of them together in order to get a natural mix of what was done in production and what we need in Foley to give it more definition. And for some reason, on this one piece of it, there wasn't any Foley, and there should have been, and we should have mixed it with them together. And I don't know why they didn't. Maybe there was a take that came in afterwards and there was no Foley put in for it. I don't know. But you notice it because that there is a lot of scuffing, and there's a lot of backwards and the weight shifting. And it is exactly what you're talking about, which is why Foley is so essential, because the Foley artist, being the sonic actor, will catch all of that. But in anything artificial, you're not going to get that.
Correct. And I know for Goldbergs, personally, I was told, and it's not to say that the Foley wasn't important, because it was just that it's not the most important thing. Goldbergs is a sitcom. It's 30 minutes. Honestly, a lot of the production was really good on that I could hear the feet and the props and everything. So it was a great guide for me when I had to do this. And I was instructed that do the best you can, obviously, because this is more for the M&E track that we are going to be mixing later than the actual production itself. And I was like, okay, cool.
People who may not know, we're talking about music and effects where it goes to another language and it goes overseas somewhere, so that it's a full complement of all the sound effects and music to go to somewhere else where they're going to be replacing the language.
Right now, because of the strikes, work is pretty slow for me, but we got a big order for Young and the Restless to go over to France.
Right.
So we strip out all the production, which means I got to replace the feet. I got to replace all the hand props and slaps and, everything like that.
So are the Foley artists doing that, or are you having to do it?
No, we're doing that all in the box.
Wow. So why aren't they having the Foley artists replace all that?
I feel it's a time issue more than anything. We get a day to cut an entire episode.
So why are they constraining schedules like that when you've got the labor there, you've got the Foley artist there, you've got the stage there? Are they just doing it for budgetary purposes?
It's mainly budgetary.
And here we go.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why that was a big other reason why I started doing Goldberg's Foley in the box, because they were like, we don't have the budget. After the pandemic, we were able to talk them into allowing the stage to do it, because it allowed them more work at a time when shows were kind of scarce. I think we had 4 or 5 shows that actually came back after the pandemic that we could, officially work on. Goldbergs was one of them. Blacklist was another, and 2 medical dramas. And I think there was maybe one more, but I don't remember what it was. Everything else had pretty much, it was either streaming that got postponed because of the pandemic,
Right.
or it just died because they were like, well, the ratings weren't that great anyway, so let's just scrub it. So that's just how it was. And so to give the Foley stages extra work and myself some work, they were like, okay, we're going to send Goldbergs to the stage for this season. So you get 2 days of work. The stage gets an extra day of work. I was like, cool, I'll take it.
Yeah. Do you think that the pandemic has changed the way that work is happening post-pandemic? The way that you're doing your workflow with Foley and the way the Foley artists are getting their workflow? Or do you think that things have gone back to pre-pandemic methodologies on how work is being handed out?
I feel it has gone back to pre-pandemic situations. I've only ever worked for Sony, so I'm only familiar with their workflow. But from what I understand is that our workflow is also very unique in some ways to other studios.
And how would that be? How would that be?
Most studios, when they do Foley, they have an editor who cues everything, and they send everything in that cue to the stage. And the stage has 2, maybe 3 days, depending on the length and how busy a show is, to not only record everything, but to make sure it's in sync.
Mm-hmm.
And then it pretty much just goes straight to the mix stage after that.
So
At Sony,
I'll just tell you, Anna, that's pretty much the way it was forever. I mean,
right.
that's how it pretty much, I mean, the technology has changed, obviously, over the years, but that's pretty much the workflow forever since I remember.
Yeah. At Sony, what we do, and this is how I was trained, we got a day to cue, but what we do is we go through pretty much all the feet go to the stage regardless, because I'm sorry, that's just a pain to cut step by step by step.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not doing that. Nobody's doing that.
Yeah.
But the props we look through, and it's like, okay, I can cut all the sit downs and the chairs and couches and stuff like that myself. Cut down, I can cut that and everything. And we send only the important things to the stage because they only give them 1 day to walk everything, to perform everything.
I'm going to take you back to the 80s.
Okay.
So this is kind of an interesting juxtaposition. In the 80s, there was a theory from some of the sound houses, because it was more boutique-y where there were more sound houses, and less of it was done in studios. There were some studios, but there were a lot of small boutique sound houses. And the basic theory would be, in a lot of them, and not all of them, and this is where it started expanding. So this is kind of a tutorial of how did we get to the point where more and more and more and more was done on a Foley stage. It started out in television, where you would get a list of the props that couldn't be covered or cut in editorial. And those are the things we covered on a Foley stage. Mm-hmm. And it would be a laundry list. It wasn't a cue sheet. It was a laundry list. So it was really clumsy and awkward. And we wished that they would cue it, but they would just give us a laundry list. We would cover all the footsteps, and we'd get a laundry list of props that weren't going to be edited in. And sometimes some of the Foley artists that I know would write library if they knew it was in the library, and they would get, like, we're out of time, library, and they'd circle it. And I can think of one female Foley artist in particular that was always circling going, library. Me, I would just kind of accommodate and say, okay, I'll do that. And then as it got more and more expansive, they would want us to do more and more, so that we were doing all the hand pads, all of the paper, all of the books, everything. And I started thinking, why are they having us do this when before it was in the library? And I started thinking, they're having us do it because they don't want to do it. They don't want to cut it in. It was more time for us, but we weren't getting more time. But they didn't want to cut it in. So we were doing more and more and more. And it was really interesting that by the late 80s, early 90s, and into the mid 90s, we were, even for television shows, doing all of the paper handling, all of the doorknobs, all of the books, all of the everything. And I kept thinking, now let me think this through. This used to be a library queue, and now we're doing all of it, and I don't understand what changed. And I would ask questions, but I wouldn't challenge it too much. And so now what's happening is more and more it's gone back to library, library, library. And I think it's really interesting that we go through these cycles, because the one thing that you really can't do in a library is the life of the actor with the way the footstep falls and the particular props that are very personal to the way the actor handles the prop. But there are certain
I
things,
agree. Yeah.
there are certain things that are pretty pedantic, like hand pats and book opens and closes and paper handling, that you can find in a library for television shows. It's not the same for features, because it's so much more sound specific on much bigger screens with much bigger sounds. But on the other hand, and this I would argue might have changed, with streaming services and television having such bigger sound bars and so much going on sound wise in homes, even that is more sound specific now, so that you really do need, I think, more specific Foley. And there's a lot more expected in the home studio, the home presentational exhibition that's going on in homes. But it's interesting to me that you're saying a lot's being done in the library now with the sound editors cutting it in, which is old school back in the day when we had 3 tracks of Foley and a lot was edited in to begin with. So it's everything old is new, everything new is old again, everything old is new again. It's really funny to me.
I'm not too surprised by that. I mean, especially when I do a cue, I look and I'm like, okay, this will take me 5 seconds to edit, to bring it in for the library, to put it in there. Takes me no time at all. I will admit right now, I hate cutting paper. Paper is the worst thing for me to cut, because I always feel like no matter how I try to cut it, it's just gonna sound like it's cut. I don't mind, like, okay, one character hands off a piece of paper to another character, they hold it, fine, I can cut that. Anything really intricate, Madam Secretary was very guilty of this all the time. It's like, okay, she takes the folder, she puts it down, okay, we're good. She picks the folder up, she starts, we're going to send that to the stage. When she starts leafing through papers, it's like, we'll send that to the stage because they can perform it better and faster than I can cut it.
Mm-hmm.
Time is always a big thing in this, because we don't get a lot of time to edit these shows. We get a day to cue and a day to edit. And depending on the budget of the show and who the producers are, if it's really busy, we can be like, hey, we're going to need some overtime to deal with this. Or they may just be like, suck it up and go with it. I hate saying that, but sometimes that is what happens. And it's just, again, I'm not too surprised that used to be the norm, because like you said, it's like this industry is a cycle of somewhere. The technology gets better, but humans are still the ones performing and editing and cutting. And so we do things that try to make things easier for everybody else in the process.
Yeah. And also, I think what happens is, and this is kind of a theoretical thing, we get into a system and then we want to change it because it isn't quite working right. So then we go do something else. Then we do that for a while. Then we change it because it isn't quite working right. So we do something else. And before you know it, we've gone full circle. And we're going back to something that isn't quite working right, but it's doing something different because it isn't working the way it was. So before you know it, we're doing it the way we used to do it. And what I find interesting about all that is, before you know it, we're doing it the way we were doing it 20 and 30 years ago. And I was talking to Mauricio Castaneda, who lives in Chile, and he has a similar theory about why we keep trying to find ways to artificially replace Foley, but we keep going back to having Foley be done by people, because it never does sound right, no matter what you do. Like he was talking about sampling, and then he was talking about all of these different systems. And I remember the PAP system, and I remember all the technological systems that come and go as I've been doing Foley, because I started in 1980. And it really does come down to, most of it does sound better when a person does it. Now, you might want to cut time and be efficient and save money by having editing do certain things. But like you're saying, paper cues have a life of their own because the actor is handling them very differently in each cue. You can do hand pats, you can do back slaps, you can do a glass up and down. Here's the one I remember would always get circled by this Foley artist that I know. Glass ups and downs. And in particular shows, there'd be a lot of drinking, a lot of glass ups and downs, and she would circle it and say, library, library, library. And she'd get pretty curt about it. And sometimes she would be correct, and sometimes I think, yes, but that was a little more specific than some of the others, or the pores might be a little more specific. And because I knew editors, I would think, I'm not sure an editor wants to cut that pore, because that pore has a particular clunk or a particular bloom to it. Some Foley artists don't always understand the editor's job. They think they do. And some editors don't understand the Foley artist's job. They think they do. And this is where we get into trouble, because a lot of editors think they know what Foley artists do, and a lot of Foley artists think they know what editors do, and a lot of Foley artists think they know what the mixers on the dub stage do, and a lot of mixers, because they hear the Foley, they actually understand more what Foley artists do. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding if you don't actually go to the space where the people do their jobs in understanding what it is they do. Very few Foley artists have ever been in an editing room. Very few. And even fewer have been on a dub stage. And so they don't really understand what happens in the dub. They may think they do, but unless they've actually been there and heard what's said, they don't really know what's going on.
I have a story for you on that.
Okay, I'd love to hear it. I'm sure we'd all love to hear it.
Oh, yeah. My fellow friend and editor, Sean, he actually worked on the latest Justified City of Primeval that
Wonderful
came out.
show. Wonderful
He
show. Love that show.
When he was working on that, one of the original Foley editor or Foley walkers, excuse me, one of the Foley walkers was out of town, and we had a sub. I've never met this woman, but hearing from Sean and a few other people, she tries to take shortcuts from what I understand. So they're working on the pilot. They're getting the pilot. They're walking the pilot. There is a scene in the pilot. If anybody has watched this, there's a scene in the pilot where they're, I'm sorry. Yes, you have.
Love that show.
Yes, they're in this old farmhouse looking for these two brothers who put out a hit on this judge, and there's a metal lid on the floor covered up by a carpet, by a rug. The soup note, we get supervisor notes. If we get supervisor notes, it doesn't matter what it is, how simple it is, how complicated it is. We send it directly to the stage because we understand the supervisor wants that emphasized. And the best way to have it emphasized is to have the Foley walker perform it.
Right.
Apparently, this substitute walker was giving Sean pushback, being like, we don't need to do that. They're not going to play it. It's stupid. We don't need to hear it. Flash forward a few months later, Sean and I got invited to a premiere to see the pilot in a nice, decent little theater in downtown Beverly Hills. And sure enough, we get to that scene and we hear that grate. We hear that lid. Like he steps on it underneath the carpet. And honestly, the Foley in that episode, I was just like, holy cow. I mean, I heard every nuance in that episode, but I definitely heard the little clank of when he steps on it and it's underneath the rug.
Yeah, it's a story point.
Yeah, it's a story point. It's important.
It's a story point.
Exactly. And so Sean texted a couple of the Foley walkers that he actually gets along with. And he's like, remember that metal grate? And they're like, let me guess. It was played up. And they're like, yep. It was totally played up. It was very important.
Right.
So yeah.
So I think a Foley artist who, yeah. So again,
Yeah.
to anyone who wants to be a Foley artist, here's my advice as someone who is very experienced. When in doubt, call the editor. When in doubt, call the editor. And if the supervisor says do it, because the supervisor got this note from the director.
Exactly. These people go to spotting sessions and they
go to
sit
spotting
there.
sessions with the director. There's a spotting session with the director and the supervisor's there. And if the supervisor says do it, I would say do it. I'll give you a story. Here's my story.
Right.
A film that had nurses in it. And I walked all the nurses in soft shoes that nurses, we always wear, like a tennis shoe, something for nurses. And the director wanted me to redo all the nurses in nurses' shoes. Now, nurses' shoes sound exactly like the kinds of tennis shoes that we walk for nurses. We know exactly what we're doing. But because the director requested I do them in nurses' shoes and my supervisor went out and bought nurses' shoes, I redid all of them in nurses' shoes and they sounded exactly the same. And it cost time and money on the Foley stage for me to do it. And I will not out the director nor the film nor anyone else. And we all laughed and we all thought, this director, who didn't direct much, did not know what he was doing, but we did it thinking, we are wasting time, we are wasting money, and this is ridiculous, but the director said to do it, so we're doing it. This is how it's done. You may know more than everybody on the film, but if the director or the supervisor tell you to do it,
you do it. Yeah. And it's not like we're sending off these cues without any instruction. Usually when we make an empty region, we put at the beginning, soup note, which means you need to do this.
But it's more than that. It's how do I say this? We are a team, and even if you are an extremely experienced Foley artist and you know more than the supervisor, because the supervisor might be inexperienced, if the supervisor's been given a note to do it, do it. I don't know what to tell you.
I don't know.
That's actually a very funny story. But in that particular instance, that actually, I'm kind of surprised that they didn't understand it was a story point, because it's a story point. Because I know the moment. Yeah, it's a story point. Well, that's very funny. But this tells you how much you have to be on your toes and think through what you're doing and why. And this is kind of a important bit. Understand the story and what the props are that you're doing and why. But also, if somebody is trying to cut corners because they're in a hurry, they want to get out of there, that's not somebody who's thinking about the story and the work and the importance of what we do. Because Foley is very important and very special. And the two Foley artists that do most of the work there, and on the other stage, the other Foley team, they're very experienced and they take it seriously. Because I know they are, and they take it seriously. And they care about the work. So, okay then. And we won't name names.
No, we don't need to name names.
We won't name names. But attitude matters. So that's a very funny story. Justified, by the way, great show.
Oh yeah.
Great show.
I actually got to work. I was the Foley editor for Morning Show this season.
Another great show. Oh my God.
I know, right?
Working on great shows.
I know. I was told that they were like, they wanted to hire, this was the first season Sony had. And so they were like, we really want to hire a female Foley editor. I'm like, well, I'm the only one. So I guess it's me.
That's great. That's a wonderful show.
And as soon as I heard I was getting the job, I was like, okay, I think I need to go back and watch the previous seasons just to see, you know, how much are they playing at the Foley, and
get the style, of it, because it's New York and they really play up the high heel shoes a lot.
Oh yeah.
They play up
and that was
the quality of the clothing. It's very precise, it's very specific, and it's very upscale New York. So everything's very pristine.
And that was a note I got when I met the supervisor, whose name was Jay. Really cool guy. Hope to work with him again. But he was like, obviously the props are important, but really the most important thing in this show are the feet. We got to make sure the feet are perfect when we do this.
Yes. So
Because
this is a story about footsteps,
Mhm.
because being extremely experienced in Foley and I notice footsteps. And in this particular show, because it's New York and everybody has a lot of money, and the studio is clean and everybody's apartments are really rich and clean and beautiful, the shoes are very expensive and you hear very expensive shoes. So the high heels are beautiful sounding and Corey's shoes are beautiful sounding and everybody's feet just sound gorgeous. The shoes are played beautifully. None of the shoes sound sloppy or poor. They all sound like $300 to $500 to $700 shoes, and they are gorgeous. And I love listening to the footsteps because they're so expensive sounding.
Even the sneakers sound expensive on that show.
I'm very sensitive to footsteps, and I cannot stand it when footsteps sound thumpy or cheap. I'm very sensitive to it. I had a conversation with Mauricio on the last show about a third world cinema film he did for a Mexican director where he wanted the class divisions in the footsteps because third world cinema is very much a South American thing, Latin American thing. And so the class was divided up by the footsteps. And so the shoes made a difference in the class orientation of the people in the film. And America doesn't think like that, but it's nice when they do. Neighborhood that's poorer, it's grittier outside. I remember doing a film called Happy New Year, and it takes place in a rich area of Florida. And so I made sure that the grit on the sidewalks was barely there because it was a very rich part of Florida. And I wanted it to barely be there because I wanted a sense of extreme wealth, which you would not do in a part of a city that was dirtier. And these little tasty things matter because you're talking about defining class. And when you're in a city that's upscale, you want it to sound a little different than a city where it's rough and lower class. And it may not seem like a big deal, but decisions like this make a difference when you're making a film. And even this Mexican director wanted to define class by the way people's shoes and the surfaces that they walked on sounded. And I thought that was an interesting thing to be talking about. It's a very interesting interview, and that's one of the interesting things Mauricio talked about. So when you're talking about morning show, one of the things that I notice all the time is the footsteps and how pristine, precise, and rich everybody sounds.
The episode, I believe it's episode 4 of this season, where the shot is literally of Corey's foot as it comes out of the SUV and it lands in a puddle on the asphalt. And then it's just a long, I never actually counted how long it was, but it felt like an eternity. But you're basically just watching him walk from wet asphalt to smooth cement to backstage smooth cement, which is a little bit drier.
I remember this cut. I remember this.
Down the stairs to carpet and I was just like,
right, because he doesn't know the backstory about what they're doing to undermine him. He doesn't know what he's about to walk into. And it's those long shots with one shot with no edits. You don't see the edit.
And he was the easiest one to cue, honestly. It's just like, okay, just change surface, change surface, change surface. It was everybody that was around him that was fun to have to follow and be like, okay, is anybody actually moving in this room? And it's like, oh, we got dancers. Yay.
And Billy Crudup is one of my favorite actors anyway. I've been following his career I actually, sidebar, saw him on Broadway in Three Sisters. Years ago. I saw an amazing cast, but he was one of the people I was excited to see. He's so interesting. If anyone hasn't watched Morning Show on Apple TV, I highly recommend it. It is it's a treat. every show you're talking about, I haven't seen Goldbergs, but the other shows you're talking about, excellent television.
Oh yeah.
So one of the things I want to ask about is when you made the transition from getting your degree at SCAD, your master's in sound design, and then taking a job at Sony, how was that transition for you? What was that like for you?
Nerve-wracking to begin with, because I was just like, okay, this was my goal to work in the industry, to get a job at a studio, to work for a major studio and do television and stuff. Um, I did notice it was a quicker pace, because in school it's an educational environment. Yes, they give you deadlines, but you get time. It's not always like the next week or the next day or something. Where here it's like, I remember a couple years ago I was working and I literally touched 3 shows in one day because one show didn't come in, then they were like, "Okay, start queuing this," and then they were like, "Oh crap, we forgot to schedule this. We need you to queue this now." So I like kept switching and switching and switching, and it was definitely hectic. But I learned to adjust to that pace more than anything else. What else have I noticed? There's just I don't want to say um there's there's not any kind of vindictiveness, but there is, competition in
Certainly.
some ways. Um, I know when I first arrived at Sony, I came on doing M&Es and soaps and stuff. Because that's kind of how they trained you. They're like, if you can do this, then we can trust you with television. And then if we trust you with television, we'll put you on features should you choose to go there. And I remember when I arrived, I was actually the 4th person down doing soaps. And then something happened and they were like, "Hey, we need you to do television. Can you cue this show?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." But I was like, "Well, what about this other guy? He's been here longer than I have." And they're like, "Well, he is not interested in moving up. So we're going to give it to you." And I was like, "Okay, that's fine if he's not interested." Well, I actually found out later he was interested, but they didn't trust him because apparently he screwed up at another point. That's another thing I've learned is that they're not very forgiving out here if you
Well, of course not.
because there's a lot of money at stake and there's
Well,
deadlines and
but
there's
there's no reason
yeah,
to be forgiving.
yeah,
And there's a lesson here.
yeah,
It's not a matter of being forgiving. It's that this is a very responsible job and it's a union job and you're paid well
mhm,
and you don't get to screw it up because you have to be accountable and your reels have to get to the stage and it has to work. And so you have to be accountable for your work.
correct. And I totally agree with that. And
It's
um,
not about making mistakes. It's about you have to catch your mistakes before they get to the stage. And if they do get to
right,
the stage, you have to be accountable and say, let me fix it right now.
yes, exactly. And I definitely have no problems doing that. Um,
So I can pretty much tell you that if this other person wasn't being trusted, it isn't because the person made one mistake.
right.
I'm curious, because there aren't as many women in post,
Mhm.
how that's been for you as a woman in post.
It's ugh, let's see. It's kind of cool being the only woman at Sony, but at the same time, it also gets kind of lonely because while Sean is my friend and he's my best friend there and everything,
Sean was at SCAD with you, so the two
Sean
of
was at
them are
SCAD, so we've been friends for like ever and everything. And I respect him and I feel he does great work in what he does. And he always takes it seriously. He doesn't do shortcuts or anything. He's like,
yeah.
this doesn't sound right. I'm going to replace it. Um, and stuff. But it's like, while it's great to have him there, it's like I do wish we had another female there because I feel like there are things I can't talk to him about because in some ways he is kind of my immediate supervisor. He handles the Foley schedule. which
Hmm.
I do not wish on my worst enemy. I've seen the headaches he's had to deal with. So if anybody's ever like, I want to schedule Foley, run away right now. And I know he would never intentionally keep me out of the loop or try to take something from me if he felt it would give him more time or more hours to work or
No,
anything
that's
like
not
that.
his nature.
No, that's not his nature. He's actually really cool about that. And I feel like if there was at least another female there, I could talk to them about certain, if I get nervous about something, if I'm like, I'm not sure if this is going to work. I felt like I can't really talk to him about that, even though he's
Is
my
there an
friend.
attitude? I don't know how much things have changed. And I don't want to say names, but you know that I know one other male editor there that was
Right.
visiting when I
Yes.
know he's wonderful.
Yes.
I know that he is wonderful and was a gentleman and was brilliant. And I worked with him back in the day, and he's fabulous and we love him. But are there some other men that don't have a great attitude working with women? Because that particular man does have a great attitude working with women.
I feel I have been extremely lucky especially with Morning Show and Jay, we got a new head of television sound who is very open to talking to me when I have an issue and stuff like that. Great guy and everything. But still, there are just some things where it's like, am I going to be considered lesser because, oh, well, she's a woman. No wonder she's complaining about this. I don't want to have to constantly have that fear of, is this going to be a problem if I take it to somebody, even though for all intents and purposes, they always seem to be in my quarter. But is this something that's going to make them be like, well, she's only saying that because she's a woman and now we got to look at her differently.
It's funny that you even have to think about that. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I find that younger men do that less.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the millennial generation doesn't have the issue anywhere near as much. That's been my experience.
That's been mine too.
I feel like millennial men are much less caught up.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of women I've talked to feel the same way.
Yeah.
So it is changing, but I do find it's taken that long.
Yeah, it has. And like I said, the change in the guard at Sony, I feel has made me trust better that I can approach my new boss and be like, hi, Zena, and say, hey, I had this idea about this show. Do you think it'll work? Or, hey, I think the stage is going to need overtime for this. Can we approve it? Whereas my old boss was, for all intents and purposes, he was a nice guy, but he was definitely part of that old guard where it was just like, can I go and say this to him?
Right. Well, and I know him, and yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because that's the generation I had to deal with. And it was really tricky navigating it. Well, as we wind this up, I'm curious if there's anything that you feel is important to talk about being a Foley editor on a studio lot that you think might be different than being a Foley editor in a boutique sound facility like Formosa Group or some of the others that might be out there, because there was a time when there weren't any of those anymore. Whereas when I started, even when I left to go get into academia, there were plenty of boutique shops, and now there really aren't very many, but there's some starting to come back.
I never actually worked in a boutique, but I know some of the ones that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I feel like it allows a little bit more cohesiveness, because being on Sony, especially when Goldbergs was shooting like right there. So I was able to kind of just see what was coming to me down the road a little bit. And it was like, I see, oh, I'm going to have roller skates in an episode, or, oh, okay, looks like we're dancing at some point. Okay, But
Yeah.
it was fun to kind of have that, because everything was right there. Where I know with the boutiques, it's like, you don't get that privilege of seeing like the actors walk by you and just be kind of like, this is what I'm going to be doing at some point. And it doesn't it doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing, but it is kind of cool to just know, oh, this is what's coming. I like seeing this. So,
Um, when I was starting out, some of the Foley stages I worked on were on the lots. I
mhm,
never worked for a studio, but I did do Foley on lots. I've done Foley on the Paramount lot, on the Warner Brothers lot. Um, I did Foley on the Disney lot, and I did a lot on the smaller stages because there was a lot of that.
mhm,
And I love working on lots, but I never worked for a studio. Oh, and
mhm.
20th, did I say Fox? Also Fox. And there was fun being on the lot, but I never worked for a studio. Most of us didn't. Very few people worked for studios when I was working in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And most of us worked in the smaller boutiques and freelanced. And now so much of it is lot. It's like everything new is old again and everything old is.
Mhm.
It's really funny how it goes back to the way it used to be because so much of it is studio now. And one of the benefits of it being boutique is the freedom from the system of the studio. And one of the benefits of the studio is the connectedness of the
Yeah.
shows. So there's pros and cons to everything. Well, I want to thank you so much for this, Anna.
Oh yeah.
This has been really wonderful, and I'm looking forward to visiting you and Sean and the others that I know out at Sony again now that we're all opened up, and it'll be so much easier to get on and I won't have to be masked and worry about all that.
Absolutely.
So have a wonderful holiday season and
You
say
too.
hello to Sean, and I'll pet Zena sometime.
Yes, you will.
Okay.